Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special forum connected to the museum's current temporary exhibit, Home, the Paintings of Loren Coleman. I'm Tom Putnam, the director here at the Concord Museum, and I'm pleased this evening to be switching roles with my colleague Allison Schilling, who produces our forums and generally introduces me. Tonight, I'm honored to do the same to her and our featured speaker, Henry Adams, the Ruth Coulter Heeds Professor of Art History at Case Western University, and perhaps most importantly, a former student of Loren Coleman's. I hope you'll come and see this truly heartwarming and evocative exhibit. I found myself during the past days of frenzy just sitting in the gallery to soak in the sense of calm, stoicism, generosity, and beauty that emanates from these paintings. The images of old New England farms and crumbling barns provide a sense of comfort, images from our childhood, visits from old friends. When asked once about Mr. Coleman's fascination with these familiar, albeit fading landscapes, Professor Adams stated, "I think Loren Coleman was inspired by different cross currents of emotion, and it's the interweaving of these cross currents that makes his painting authentic rather than trite. At the root of his emotional response to these things is something that clearly goes back very early to his happy experiences on his grandparents' farm in Concord, a respite from the misery of his childhood in the 1930s Chicago." I'm sure we'll hear more about that this evening. Henry Adams is the author of numerous scholarly and popular articles, as well as 14 books or book-length exhibition catalogs. Among these are Eakins Revealed, which the painter Andrew Wyeth described as, quote, "without question, the most extraordinary biography I have ever read on an artist," and a book, Tom and Jack, The Intertwined Lives of Thomas Hart Benton and Jackson Pollock, of which the book list reviewer noted, quote, "Henry Adams practices art history with a novelist's narrative skills and psychological acuity, a sleuth's instincts, and a gift for sea change interpretations." At Case Western Reserve University, Professor Adams recently received the Baker Nord Award, bestowed on the most outstanding scholar in the humanities. He also served earlier in his career as the curator of the Cleveland Museum of Art and the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. And early in his career, he partnered with Ken Burns to produce a documentary on Thomas Hart Benton, which was broadcast nationally on PBS to an audience of 20 million. As mentioned previously, our moderator this evening is Allison Schilling, an artist in her own right, who also studied art history at Mount Holyoke College and has a master's in museum and arts education from Tufts University. Allison also developed the Family Interactive for this new exhibit, complete with original watercolor paintings and our general guidebook for those who visit the show. If you have questions this evening, you can submit them to us via YouTube's chat feature. Please join me now in offering a warm virtual welcome to Henry Adams and Allison Schilling.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thanks for that. Last night we had a program with this historian, Mary Beth Noren, and she wrote this 700-page book on early American history. So I've been very delighted that I got to instead carry around my book of Loren Coleman's paintings for the past couple of weeks, and I got this role tonight. So thank you for that. Why don't we get started? We can talk about Loren Coleman is really known for his incredibly detailed paintings on a disappearing New England, but his legacy is equally significant as an educator, teaching at Middlesex for 27 years. And you know firsthand what his impact was, what you've called, the touch of the miraculous is how Coleman made you feel in the classroom. So why don't you tell us a little bit about his teaching?
Well, I think the nature of being in high school is you're missing most of what is going on. But Loren was, I think, definitely the most popular and the most charismatic teacher at Middlesex. And certainly for me, it was a wonderful experience to work with him. And of course, as is typical of a high school student, you're completely wrapped up in your own miseries and neuroses, and you have no sympathy for anyone else. He always seemed completely at ease, He was wonderfully articulate. He was supportive. I might say that at Middlesex, he, in addition to teaching, he did an amazing variety of other things. Whenever someone needed some calligraphy to be done, he had to do it. And he actually had a rather remarkable career as a set designer. And it's too bad that I don't think that's been recorded in the way one would now with digital imagery. But, for example, he did a set design for Murder in the Cathedral where he sort of threw, arches and illusions. He created the sense that you were in this enormous medieval cathedral when actually he was dealing with a stage which was very small and narrow. He really was a master of that kind of artistic trick, and was very varied in his abilities.
That's great. Well, maybe you weren't paying as much attention in high school, but you were lucky to then reconnect with Coleman as an adult in his later years. So what was it like to get to know you?
Well, it was something like 40 years later. And actually, I'm fortunate that my brother was a trustee at Middlesex and was very involved with the school. I had not seen Loring literally for 40 years. And just on a whim, I got back in touch with him. And I'd have to say that, the few years I spent with him after that point were one of the most rewarding experiences of my career. A lot of insights, because I guess I'd say that he always seemed completely articulate and in control and self-assured. And one of the things I learned is that as a child, he was dyslexic, and going to school was a miserable experience for him. And I had always thought that his classroom lectures were just very relaxed and spontaneous. And I learned that he wrote them out in longhand and, then sort of delivered them from memory. But yeah, and, he grew up in Chicago. One of the things I like to embroider a little bit is once early on when he was shopping for clothes with his mother in the Marshall Field department store, who should come up the elevator but Al Capone, who apparently did all his shopping for his kids at Marshall Field. So I'd like to tell people that, my art teacher knew Al Capone. Yeah, one can improve that a little. He was the best friend of Al Capone. But I mean, it's amazing to think of, the things that are in a human life. And, of course, that was the era of bootlegging and Loring remembered, this was the time when fire engines were still drawn by horses. And he remembered once when there was a fire alarm and the fire engine came down the street and the horses slipped on the ice, and the fireman hopped out of the wagon and, put the horses back on their feet and galloped on.
Well, so we know that Coleman is this really incredible art educator, but maybe you could talk about his art education. How did he become interested in painting? And then I know watercolor wasn't really what he was originally learning, what brought him there, which is now what we consider the main body of his work.
Well, there are a lot of things that are kind of mysterious about that, but quite early, I think partly because reading was so difficult for him, he focused on art, and how would I say, had a very exact, very analytical mind, and this was the period where learning to be an artist was almost like learning to be a doctor. You learned about color and light and values and about perspective. And there was a lot of very rigorous training that went into it. Middlesex actually had a rather interesting art teacher, Russ Cattell, who I think is chiefly remembered now for his work with early American furniture, but clearly knew a lot about painting as well. And I think he took Loring under his wing. Early on, Loring studied with a pretty well-known American painter, John Dudley Murphy, and then with the kind of protege of Murphy, John Ensor. Yeah, got very rigorous training at that early stage. I think interestingly, when he started painting, he worked mostly in oil. Yeah, it's a little mysterious to me how he turned to watercolor, but of course, one of the interesting things is he really handled watercolor as though it was a major artistic statement. And I might say that if you think of American art in international terms, actually watercolor is where American artists have achieved their greatest achievements. That, Winslow Homer, John Singer Sargent, Edward Hopper, these are people who are preeminent in watercolor, and there's no one in Europe who achieved comparable statements in the medium.
That's great. You have such a broad background in art history. It's wonderful to hear about some of these incredible influences in watercolor and the medium. So thank you. So more about Coleman's life. He was really influenced by some major events. He, in his autobiography, he says that he was studying in Boston and got married on December 6, 1941, the day before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And he served in World War II and eventually became the head of the art department at Fort Lee. So do you want to talk about his time in the Army, how that really influenced him?
Well, I think that one of the interesting things about Loring Coleman, and I think his paintings are marvelous, but in a way he was larger than that. He was someone who was extraordinarily good at a great variety of things. And I think that perhaps connected with his dyslexia, there was something about the military discipline that really suited him. But I think he did a remarkable job in the Army. And I might say it's one of the surprising things about Loring Coleman. His work is very precise and exact, but he's the first person who spoke to me enthusiastically about the work of Jackson Pollock and convinced me that there was really something going on there. And actually, when he was a teacher at Middlesex, there was a Jackson Pollock show at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and he took the trouble to take his students there and somehow managed to persuade Monk Terry, who was the rather conservative headmaster of the school, to drive them all there. I can't imagine what Monk Terry thought about Jackson Pollock. And then later he had his class all try to make Jackson Pollocks. And I remember him commenting that the people who were very gifted at making realistic paintings were mostly the same people who were good at making Jackson Pollocks. He really was a very thoughtful, open-minded person. In a way that I think speaks to the best aspects of American traditions.
Mm-hmm. That's great. In his book, he had a funny anecdote about the headmaster, that in his early years, he was called into the office and it took him everything he could not to salute the headmaster.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, how would I say, actually one of the remarkable things about Loren Coleman, and it's funny, I think it's harder with any of us to explain what's the drive that pushes us forward, but this is the period where private schools worked on a very rigid, very clearly defined framework. And before he took a job teaching at Middlesex, he insisted that he needed 2 days off a week to spend on his painting. That this was the period where most teachers at Middlesex lived at the school and they worked 7 days a week. And that was a major negotiation to get those 2 days. And I think it's also extraordinary when you think of the shift you've got to make, from working to doing something else, to doing your painting. It's really what he did as an artist is admirable, not only as art, but just for the kind of commitment and energy that went into that.
That's great. Well, I think we've teased everyone enough talking about Coleman without showing any of his art. So why don't I pull up our first painting here. So this is the namesake of the exhibition that we opened up at the museum. This is his painting Home, which is what we named the exhibit. So, this painting really is a good one to look at first. It embodies Coleman's fascination with New England farms and rambling stone walls and, of course, winter.
This is, I might say, kind of a fascinating painting. It's a farm that was in Sterling, Massachusetts, that one of his sons, happened to be driving by and saw it and thought it would be a good subject for his father to make a painting of. But this is a painting that took 21 years to complete. He basically did a very careful drawing of it outdoors from the motif, and he put it in a drawer and for some reason never made a watercolor of it. And 21 years later, he took it out and completed it. And shortly after completing the painting, he went back to the site and found that the house was still standing, but the barn and the other building were completely gone. So, this is a funny combination of something that is completely accurate, but by the time he finished the painting, the motif had completely vanished. And I think that one of the things, it's a subtle thing about what keeps a painting like this from being trite, but you can see that this is not just a barn, this is a very particular barn, and it's got kind of unusual double windows on the upper part. There's something very exactly observed and very much felt in the way Loren did a painting like this.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you can talk maybe a little more broadly. We mentioned that he grew up in Chicago during a very difficult time. So what brought him to have such a love and fascination with these barns of Concord and New England?
Well, I think he came back to visit his grandmother. He was there at the end of the period where New England farming was still a viable business. And I mean, I think what is intriguing about it, because Loren was always a very cheerful, upbeat, positive, encouraging person, but there's clearly a sense of loss of, and also the struggle he went through being dyslexic. And I might say that another tragedy of his life is that he had a younger brother, Lindsay, who died of appendicitis when he was a student at Middlesex, and I think just 13 or 14 years old. So this is someone, who who's living life in a very positive way, but also has a deep sense of the tragic aspect of life. And I think that there's that quality, you might almost call it New England grit, where you know, things are not good and you just kind of tighten your belt and you move forward as best you can.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the underlying spirit of many of these paintings.
That's great. Oh,
I might mention in passing that Loring was an early appreciator of Andrew Wyeth, the great American painter, and he actually early on, when he couldn't have had much money, he purchased a major Andrew Wyeth watercolor.
Wow. We have a question from the audience. So someone noticed that there are many dogs in his paintings. So is there a backstory to why the dogs, and certainly there are other animals that he features?
I think you see dogs and you sometimes see wild animals such as foxes and that kind of thing. And I think that that's a way of bringing animation into what would otherwise be, you know, a more impersonal motif. And I think that at some level it's interesting. You seldom see human figures in his paintings. It's a way of bringing you into another kind of consciousness. You know, you can't help thinking about what a dog would think when it was going by a barn like this.
That's great. Move on. So here, this painting he named New England Classic, and you already mentioned how these paintings aren't really trite, so they're not really classic in their depiction of the barn in the New England. But why don't you talk about this one a little bit?
Well, I think in this one of the things that's marvelous is the sense of texture on that weathered wooden wall. And yeah, also the sense of light and the seasons. Yeah, and again, you've got a little dog that's sitting in the foreground who becomes a kind of surrogate, you know, for you, the person. Yeah, there's a wonderful sense of season. Certainly not all of his paintings, but many of his paintings are autumn or winter. And I think that there's, well, there's an austerity to that, but a kind of strength. It's sort of celebrating that quality of New England.
Great. And you mentioned how his sons mentioned the barn in the last one. How did Coleman really find these subjects and look for these places to go? What was that process like for him?
Well, of course, that whole discipline is interesting, but he must have spent a good deal of time driving around looking for these motifs. And I know that, I mean, he wrote this marvelous memoir, but in many instances, I mean, doing a painting like this, you know, he was standing outside this barn for quite a long time, and he would often get to know the people who lived in these buildings.
We call him a plein air painter. Do you agree? Would he sit out and paint these?
Yeah, and I guess I'd say that one of the things which is subtle, but there's some way that you can tell that he was actually, you know, he didn't just do this from a photograph. He actually stood outside and recorded this from life. And I don't know if I could even explain that. I've done a little bit of watercolor myself. I don't claim to be a master, but you do learn that there's a quality to actually drawing from the motif, and there's something challenging about it that creates a different kind of emotional statement.
Mm-hmm. And something being outside, so you mentioned the first thing you said was the light in this painting. And that was something that interested him too, right? He would return to the same motif, but at different times of day.
Well, of course, there are wonderful things, and a lot of painting has to do with the difference between a clearly defined edge and an edge that flows into other forms. But here, for example, the distinction between the very light blue sky and the roof with the white snow on it. And of course, in watercolor, you're not creating the white with white pigment. You're using white paper to do that. So it takes a lot of calculation and planning to do a painting like this. You know, it's a multiple step process. I don't know how you could define how many steps there are to it, but it's one of those processes that has 50 or 60 steps to it. And you just hope that by the time you get to the 60th step, you've done everything right and it actually looks like something.
It was a good thing what you said. He had an exacting and analytical mind. That's what he needed.
Yeah, it's a very disciplined guy.
Yeah.
I might say there's an amusing story about one of his paintings. Well, I don't know. Are you going to show me the blue door?
Yeah, we can go to that.
Why don't we go to the blue door and then get back to this other one? But it actually wasn't this painting. It was one that was similar to this, of a door with glass in it, where he was painting it and a bunch of kids came up and were admiring it. And then there was one girl who was looking at it very intently, but didn't say anything. And so he asked her what she thought of it. And she said, and I think this is a marvelous statement. She says, "That's so good. It looks like it was done by somebody else." But I think that there is a quality, and you know, all of us in whatever sphere have these moments where we do something that came out right, and you know, 10 minutes later, we don't have a clue as to how we did it. It looks like it was done by somebody else. Of course, this is a wonderful example of his sense of texture.
Really beautiful. Well, you know, we've talked about how exacting and the level of almost perfection that he puts in, but he also, there's a lot that's expressive and almost abstract in some of his work.
Well, I think what's interesting, and I mean, this would be an example of it, but you know, you can almost think of this door as an abstract expressionist composition. And along with Pollock, another artist he greatly admired was Franz Kline. And there's a boldness of composition in many of his paintings of barns and collapsing barns that resembles Franz Kline.
This painting, right, he did while he was in Norway, and that color blue was really what struck him and what he wanted to capture, right?
Yeah, and again, there's this affinity for sort of northern places, which is interesting.
Yeah.
You know, for the most part, he's not a painter of tropical jungles.
Well, this one is so striking. You talk about how he uses the white of paper. There's also, we've talked about the disappearance and how these barns are kind of falling apart. So how is he using that kind of metaphysically, but also in his representation of what's disappearing?
Well, of course, I think this is an interesting example of a painting that just has a very poetic quality to it, and the way, I mean, it's kind of uncanny how he creates this sense of mist. But also, I mean, a painting like this has a kind of metaphysical aspect of, you know, the difference between solid things and illusions. And, you know, there is this sense of passing time in his work and of change and decay. And, you know, perhaps also of seeing change as something that's not just decay, but a process of metamorphosis.
Yeah, he wrote about.
I might say that, you know, from Cleveland, something like this is amusing. I, you know, grew up in Lincoln, Massachusetts, and thought that it was completely normal to have 18th century stone walls through your property. And of course, you realize that that's very unique to New England.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are parts of New England where you see these stone walls everywhere.
Yeah, and Coleman sure found a lot of them.
And of course, there's a poetry to that. If you think before modern earth moving equipment, how much work it must have been to roll these stones out of the fields and make them into walls, it's really kind of amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're really lovely. Coleman wrote,
and I might say little touches here, the, you know, the windows that are not lit and the ones that are lit up with light, and you know, wondering what's going on inside. You know, there's just a lot going on here.
mm-hmm.
And I think this foreground of leaves is kind of remarkable. I mean, I don't quite know how he did that, but.
Yeah, the foreground and those two windows, like you said, they hold the composition together. Everything would have disappeared without them.
And I mean, it's interesting because if you covered up the windows, it'd be a much less good painting.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. He wrote about this painting in his book. I thought I'd just read what he wrote. It was very nice. So, as I began my drawing, a light drizzle soon changed to a very fine snow, almost like salt. The effect was startling. The barn gradually began to fade away, enveloped by the gray mist, so that the sky and barn became the same color. Only the faintest outline of the barn remained, accented by a few barn windows. I wondered at the value change in this gray-green stone wall as it receded. The ground was covered with frozen leaves. They too receded, lightened and disappeared in the distance. Only the striking dark green of the black opening of the shed doors seemed to hold the composition together. Even as he's sitting there, things are disappearing, and he's capturing that in the moment.
Yeah, I mean, this is just a painting that's very well observed. I mean, look at how this stone wall recedes in the distance, and this kind of light is particularly hard to portray. In a day with the blue sky, you have clear shadows coming from one direction, but this is something where it's a very diffuse light, and you know, really major technical challenge to make the forms stand in space, and yet to capture that very elusive quality of the light.
We have another question from the audience about if he painted from photographs, which we discussed a little bit, but the one from Norway of the Blue Door, I can go back to. He did take some pictures.
I think with the Blue Door, he did take photographs. I think he rarely painted from photographs. I think that most of the time he worked directly from the motif, and that's what's, you know, what's wonderful about it. And as I say, you know, there's a quality to painting from the motif that, while it's subtle, I guess I'd say the test of a work of art is if you hang it on the wall and live with it for 6 months. A lot of things look really wonderful the first day, and after 6 months, you're sick of them. And other things kind of grow on you, in some mysterious way. And, you know, to put it in a phrase, I think in some ways Loring's paintings are better than they look. That if you spend time with them, you appreciate them more.
Mm-hmm. So why don't we, haven't looked at all of them. Here's one. This is The Four Winds Are the Ringmaster. Maybe you could talk about this and also talk about that very kind of evocative title. He did really like to title his paintings. Is that typical? What's the pantheon of titling your artwork?
Well, of course, I mean, I think that this is a painting that, you know, brings up some of the dualities of what his work is about. But a cupola like this, you know, it certainly has an element of nobility to it, maybe even a bit of pretentiousness, and it, you know, evokes Mount Vernon and that kind of thing. At the same time that this is clearly a weathered, falling apart building. And yeah, there are all kinds of poetic associations to that. I mean, it's interesting that he didn't paint the human figure very much, but you feel that this building is a kind of metaphor for a certain kind of New England person, and maybe for Loring himself. I mean, surely at some level you can see all these paintings as self-portraits, and you know, of that quality of endurance. Yeah, and you know, many of these paintings are evoking qualities of you know, light in the seasons and the weather. I mean, I think that this one is interesting in that you can really sense the time of year, partly from the bare branches, but even if the branches weren't there, just looking at the light in the sky, you can tell that this is a kind of November, December day. You know, I think that's the trick of a really, or the talent of a really good artist, that they can really evoke a moment and a mood, and you're not quite sure how they do it, but you know, it conveys that feeling.
He does seem to have an interest in these bare branches of trees, especially in
Yeah.
barn in here.
And yeah, you know, I think that it's not unlike the device known as synecdoche in poetry, where you evoke a whole from a part, and from seeing the branches of the trees, you can imagine the whole setting.
Yeah. We have one more slide that we have. This one will warm us up a bit from all of these winter pictures. This is one of the few. What looks like spring.
This is interesting because, I mean, how would I say? This is where he's not taking a conventionally pretty subject. You have these kind of rusting old trucks. Mm-hmm. And how would I say it? This is a issue that goes back in art to people like Whistler, where through the genius of the artist, you can transform a seemingly ugly subject into something that's beautiful. Yeah, lots of interesting things, you know, the way he handles the transparency of the windows and so forth. It's very artfully done. And how would I say, the glass on the truck window is picking up a little bit of reflection from the light, so that it has a slightly brighter quality. It's acting as a kind of mirror.
Mm. Well, we've had the exhibit of his paintings up here at the Concord Museum for a couple of weeks now, and the most prominent reaction is people they say, I can't believe this is even watercolor. The way he's handling this is so exacting. How does he use the medium here?
Well, of course, there are lots of interesting issues there, and it is interesting that some painters seem to be very well suited to watercolor and others to oil, and it seems to take a different temperament and different approach. A famous example is Charles Birchfield, who worked mostly in watercolors. At one point, because he thought they'd be more saleable, he tried to do oil paintings, and there are letters where he's writing, I'm going to learn to paint in oil or I'm going to die in the attempt. And then 6 months later, he's given up oil and is back to watercolor again, because he realizes that something about it suits him. I think that, watercolor has a special kind of luminosity, and how would I say? But, well, oil paint is gooey. It's sort of like toothpaste. And if you don't have the right temperament for it, it sort of turns into this muddy goo. And there's something about watercolor that has this luminous quality to it that you really can't achieve in oil.
Mm-hmm. And Coleman really uses that, right? When you talk about him using the paper to show white, he's not shy about letting the light shine.
Yeah, and I might say that, how would I say, even though these paintings in one way are precise, if you look at the individual areas, he's not just filling in the lines. There's a great understanding. Look at the trees in the background, but he's basically wetting the paper before he applies the pigment, and it takes a lot of technical skill to handle the wetness of the pigment and its degree of wetness, and to have these areas that kind of flow into each other, but then these other edges that are very sharp and crisp.
Mm-hmm. We have another question from the audience about kind of his technique. So we've talked about the 60 steps to making a watercolor painting, and he's doing this outdoors in the winter. So how does he handle the medium under somewhat adverse conditions, not in his studio?
Well, frankly, this is something I don't know, because I think he probably touched up the paintings a little bit in the studio, but painting outdoors is very challenging. I know that I've done it on days like this, and one of the weirdest experiences is if it's cold enough, the watercolor will literally freeze when you're putting it on the paper, and you can, as you apply the brush stroke, you can see the water turning into ice crystals. Yeah, and I guess I'd say that the essence of painting outdoors is that there's always something that's going wrong. There are mosquitoes, or there's wind, or and also if you go outdoors, you always find that there's something that you thought you had that you needed. You're always missing some pigment or some brush that you thought you put in your pack, and instead, it fell out and it's lying on the floors of your studio. I guess I'd say that watercolor is interesting. How would I say? You can actually cheat with watercolor a good deal, but with watercolor at a certain point, how would I say, if you want the whites, you've got to leave them white. If you want it to look crisp and neat, you basically don't have that many chances to apply the brushstroke, so that it takes a very special kind of mind to go through all those steps in the right order and make it come out. And I think the essence of it, I mean, I think he worked very hard at these things, but that at each step, he's using tremendous concentration to make sure that everything is right. I guess an interesting example of that, I remember reading about the Beatles, who in the early days of these layered albums like Sgt. Pepper, they basically did it in 4 separate tracks. And basically you laid down one track and you laid another one over it and another over that. But the challenge was that if you screwed up on the 3rd track, you can't take it out. You've got to just start all over again. And I think watercolor is a little bit like that, where you can do it perfectly 90% of the way, and then if you screw up in that last 10% of your time, it's over. Yeah, there's nothing you can do to fix it.
That was one of the things that struck me about Spectral Barn. So he made this whole painting and then splattered that white gouache across the whole thing. It took some guts, I think.
Yeah, and it's a very magical effect. And I guess I'd say what's interesting about painting, and I think a lot of artists like this, it's the things you don't even notice that are the key, but it's those little dots of white in front of the dark trees that really create that sense of, how would I say, you know exactly how cold it is. It's not a freezing cold day, but it's a day where if you stand outside, you get extremely chilled very quickly.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Well, we've talked about these are all the paintings I had, so maybe we can stop sharing. But we talked a bit about his travels to Norway, where he painted the Blue Door, and this was something he brought back to the classroom a lot. And he did travel, so what we think of him as this hometown New England paintings, but he really was influenced by the greater world. What was his time traveling like?
Well, he did quite a bit of traveling, because I know he went to places like Egypt and various places in Europe. And I mean, one of the things he did, how would I say, a very disciplined guy, but he goes somewhere like Egypt, and you know, this is the period where you didn't have the internet, and he took you know, very wonderful slides of these places, which he would show in his classes at Middlesex. So that, and you know, again, I think these things are subtle because his paintings have a very New England quality and are focusing on New England barns, but this is someone who has thought very carefully about the history of art and, you know, is open to very many aspects of that. Yeah, I mean, I think what's wonderful about art is its enduring quality. And it's like when you go to some little Italian hill town and there's a beautiful church and, you know, there's a beautiful fresco there. And you feel that Loring's paintings have a little bit that quality where 500 years from now, someone will be in a place where one of his paintings is hanging, and it will have a special kind of life.
That's wonderful. Well, I have one last question, which is also something that someone, we have a couple more, but we'll from the audience, but I'll ask them first. So we have, there's something in these paintings that we don't get to see when we look at them on the computer, which is their scale. He paints on an enormous scale, which you call in your introduction one of his tricks. So what does the size of these works do to help the viewer's appreciation and understanding? You know, what's the impact of these, of the scale of the work?
Well, how would I say? I think good artists often have the trick of some sort that it's making you see things in an unusual way. But watercolor was traditionally seen as kind of an amateur's medium and as a medium that was somehow less important than oil painting for whatever reason. And I think that by giving these paintings large scale, he's giving them a monumental quality. And you know, this is one of the aspects of his work. I think he has a very good understanding of form, which actually comes out of his appreciation of people like Franz Klein, who were handling abstract form in a very powerful way. Yeah, and then, you know, at the same time that they have the monumentality of an oil painting, there's something about the translucency and glowing quality of the color that is very different. It's almost more like a stained glass window. It has a magical, luminous quality.
Yeah, when we were looking at the cupola, you mentioned how it was, you treated it as this noble work, and
yeah,
making it big like that is
yeah,
giving their due.
yeah.
So, oh, and that's my big sell for coming to see the exhibit in person, because, you know, it's really something to be in the gallery and to be face to face.
Yeah, I think that photographs do not do justice to his work at all. That I mean, the photographs are fine, and I might say that photography is kind of brutal. I know with things I've done, I think I've done a masterpiece, and then I take a photograph of it, and it looks looks like junk. Yeah, it's challenging. A lot is lost in photographs, and to make something that will stand up in photographs. But yeah, there's something about the actual work, and certainly in front of the actual work, you have much more of a sense that it's something that is created by hand, and that every brushstroke is a thought.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have one kind of double question from the audience, which is really about the technique and really about creating white. So would he have used Frisket, which is a masking medium, for the preservation of the white spaces? And then they mentioned that Winslow Homer used sandpaper to be reductive, take away the white. So did Coleman use that technique?
I think he used a variety of techniques, though I think that for the most part, the white is, you know, just has to do with thinking it through very carefully beforehand as to where the white is going to be left. I think when you're dealing with, how would I say, very fine lines like tree branches that are silhouetted against a barn, he might have used some Frisket, but I think that mostly he's not using that many technical tricks. He's just being very thoughtful about the way he builds up the process.
Yeah, when you see them, you can tell that. And then also he uses the wash a couple of places to give it.
Yeah, yeah. and I think that's rare, though I might say with someone like Winslow Homer. I think with any artist who's a good artist, they cheat more than they let on. And someone like Degas is the classic example of that, where he would draw over photographs. He would, he mixes oil and pastel. He's going to do whatever he needs to do to get the effect he wants, and if he has to cheat a bit to do that, he'll go ahead and do that. But I think that that a really experienced artist a lot of the time doesn't need to cheat, because they have thought it through so clearly that they can just go through that discipline process.
Well, so I'll want to give you the final word. You've learned from Coleman, and what can you tell us that you want us to end on? So what's something you've learned from him that we can all learn, and what do his paintings tell us today? How can we appreciate them?
I think really the main thing to say is that they should just come to the show and look at the things. And I think what's interesting about art is that you can talk about it up to a certain point, but talking about it is really just setting the stage for looking at it. And, what I try to do as a teacher or writer, as an art historian, is not to pretend that you can ever reduce a painting to words, but to use words to get people to start looking carefully. And everyone takes away kind of different things. But anyway, I think he's a wonderful painter, and caught a moment of New England, and even more largely captured a quality of America, which we certainly haven't lived up to all the time, but maybe can be inspiring to us.
Great. Well, thank you for setting the stage for us. I know I'll appreciate the paintings more when I see them tomorrow morning.
And I think the thing that's too bad, I think he's an extraordinary painter, but he also was so gifted in many other ways, his stage sets, and, just what an inspiring human being he was. So anyway, thank you for inviting me. It's been great.